All right, let's get started. Thanks to everyone for joining us in this Q&A with Dr. Tanya Harrison. I am Eric Porper. I'm one of the co-founders of Warp News, and we're so excited to help sponsor the Warp Space Summit. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Tanya Harrison to give a little more of a background. We loved your presentation earlier, and I know we have some questions coming in, but I thought we'd start by just, you gave a brief overview of who you are, but maybe a little more on your background.
Sure. So I assume everybody that was here tuned into the talk, but if you didn't, I'm Tanya Harrison, and I'm currently the Director of Science Strategy at a commercial Earth observing company called Planet Labs. But my whole career before this was working on Mars missions for different NASA missions, the Mars rovers, including Opportunity, Curiosity, and Perseverance. And then I worked on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter as well, doing operations for the camera systems on board all of those. So processing the images when they came back to Earth and looking at them from both a geology standpoint, since I have a PhD in geology, seeing if we could learn anything important about the history of Mars, and from an engineering standpoint to see if the cameras themselves were functioning properly. I did my PhD at the University of Western Ontario in Canada. I also have a master's degree in Earth and Environmental Sciences from Wesleyan University, which is a little bit of a misnomer because even though it was Earth Sciences, I focused on Mars. And then my undergraduate degree I did at the University of Washington in Seattle in astronomy and physics. And there I also worked on Mars for a little bit, but I started out doing the evolution of stellar clusters and looking at the metal content of stars and how that influenced how they behave. But I always knew I wanted to work on Mars. I just didn't realize that if I wanted to study Mars, I should have been a geologist rather than an astronomer. I thought planets are in space, so I should study astronomy, and quickly found out that astronomy is definitely more for studying stars, at least at the university where I was at.
I would assume that's a common misconception for people looking to study Mars or other areas of space.
Probably, yeah. Like if you want to study any of the rocky planets or asteroids, like geology is really the way to go because you have to learn the foundations on Earth before you can take that and apply it to another planet. But if you want to study the gas giants like Jupiter or Neptune, then you actually want to study like atmospheric science or fluid dynamics, because most of what you're looking at on those planets is the dynamics of the fluids, like the gases in their atmospheres.
Sure. And so just before we get on to some of the questions, I'm always curious, at what point in your life did you realize you had this interest in Mars, space and Mars specifically?
So I've been interested in space ever since I was about 5, thanks to a bunch of different things, like growing up watching Star Trek and just being really interested in looking at the sky in general. The Magic School Bus Lost in the Solar System book was very influential when I was a kid. And but it was actually this movie called Big Bird in Japan that got me really obsessed, because Big Bird ends up visiting the Japanese princess of the moon. So that really got my obsession with space started, but it didn't focus on Mars specifically until the Pathfinder mission landed in 1997. And then when I saw the videos come out of Sojourner, this little tiny rover driving out onto the surface of Mars, I thought, that's amazing. I want to work on Mars rovers when I grow up.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's get to some of the questions. Some people posted a few questions in the Q&A in the chat. So I'll go ahead and start reading them off. So Dan asked 2 questions. The first one is there any cavern area on Mars that is possible to explore with rovers? And are caverns interesting to explore?
So they're definitely interesting to explore because they've been proposed as a great place for habitats, because you've got some built-in radiation shielding by all of the rock that's around you. The downside is all of our communication systems right now rely on line of sight. So like the rovers have to transmit directly to Earth or directly to satellites in orbit, and then the satellites talk to Earth. So if we're inside a cave, we don't have a way to get a signal out of there unless you have something where the rover doesn't go very far in and you've left a base station maybe at the outside of the cave. And so it talks to that, and then that talks to the satellites. It's also tricky because the caves are dark and we don't have a good idea of what they look like. Usually when we're talking about caves on Mars, we're talking about lava tubes, and lava tubes on Earth form when you have lava that's flowing kind of like a conduit, and then it starts to cool from the outside in. And so you get this shell, but over time, the roof will collapse in certain places. And that's the only way that we actually know that these caves exist on Mars. We see places where the roof is caved in. So that means there's a lot of rubble on the ground. And if you visit lava tubes here on Earth, they're not easy to trek through. You're kind of climbing over all these jagged rocks and boulders. So it would be very tricky to do thorough exploration of any caves with a rover. We'd really need to send some humans.
And Dan also asked, are there any advanced rovers projects for the moon, like resource harvesters and manufacturing rovers?
There's certainly companies that are trying to work on that kind of stuff, going to places like the permanently shadowed regions near the South Pole, where we've detected water ice from both lunar emissions and ground-based measurements. But I don't think we have any that are specifically slated to launch yet, at least like on the NASA side. We have a few things planned in terms of orbiters to get a better idea of where that ice is, since the data we have right now is not super high resolution. But it's something that people are really, really focused on, is getting to that ice in those permanently shadowed craters. So I think in the next, between now and 2030, we'll see maybe some NASA commitments, but also some commercial rovers try to explore that area.
Another question is, how can people contribute to the space program with open source projects? People from around the world contributed code for the Mars copter. What are the best platforms to be part of such projects?
That's a really great question. So there's different levels of things that you can contribute. For some missions, they have projects where you can help process the imagery from the missions. So the Juno mission at Jupiter right now is a really great example. The imagery from all these missions, at least on the NASA side, goes out to the public pretty quickly. For some of the missions, it's within 24 hours of when the data is collected. And anybody can go on and play with that data, but Juno specifically put out a call to the community to say, hey, we'd love to see you process this imagery and see what you come up with. So if you go to the Juno mission website, in the imagery section, there's actually like filters that you can select to look at the imagery that's been processed by sort of amateur image processors versus the actual Juno team. There's also groups like Zooniverse, where you can go and do citizen science projects. You can do things like helping map out different types of galaxies in the sky surveys. You can even do stuff that's not space related, like help look at old shipping logs to understand how climate change has, how the climate and the weather has changed over time. But I would keep an eye out on like the mission pages for future missions to see if there's calls for things like they did with the Ingenuity helicopter, because they sort of crop up here and there depending on what mission is doing the work. If it's still active, there's another group called Planet 4, where they were trying to map out features around the south polar area of Mars. I don't know if it's still active, but it's something you might take a look at too if you want to help map the south pole of Mars.
Awesome. And then what is Ingenuity's main mission?
So Ingenuity is actually a tech demo. So it didn't have a science mission per se when we sent it. The goal was just to see, can we actually fly on Mars? Because with the lower gravity and the extremely thin atmosphere, we weren't entirely sure that we'd be able to. And we certainly tested Ingenuity in a Mars simulation chamber on Earth at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but that only gives you sort of the atmospheric density. We don't know when we get there what the weather is going to be like, if there's any kind of like little eddies that might throw it off, or if maybe the dust in the atmosphere would cause some problems if it was really dusty when we landed. So the goal was just, can we fly? So the first test was fly up and then fly down. And that worked. So then each mission since then, each test since then has been a sequentially more complicated thing. So up and down, let's fly up, over, come back and down. Let's fly up, over, and land somewhere differently from where we started, and getting progressively longer in terms of the flight distance and duration. And we just finished flight 14 now. So the mission, the tests have been wildly successful. So they actually transferred it from being just a tech demo to an operational demo. So they're trying to see, can we actually use the imagery from Ingenuity to influence things like navigational decisions of Perseverance? And that's kind of the main goal of having little drones like this, would be to fly out ahead of the rover, do higher resolution mapping of the terrain from the air to help the rover figure out how it can navigate. Because right now we're using incredibly high resolution satellite imagery, but it's still not high enough resolution to see all of the hazards that the rover might encounter, because these boulders, some of them are just below the resolution limit of the cameras that we have right now.
Okay, we're going to try to let some people who have video questions into our room.
Yeah. Thank you for your interesting talk earlier, Dr. Harrison. My question is, when you talked about the Jezero crater, you mentioned that there was water there for a geologically significant amount of time. How long is geologically significant? Is it tens of thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years?
In this case, it's probably hundreds of thousands of years, but we're not entirely sure. So hopefully once we analyze the rocks more in Jezero, we'll get a better idea.
Okay. And my other question is about the rover. You mentioned that it has autonomous capabilities, but does that mean that it's fully autonomous, or do humans still control it in some way?
It's definitely not fully autonomous. It's, I think we're a little cautious about making the rovers fully autonomous until we test out a lot of those systems, just because, you know, these are really expensive missions. And so if anything goes wrong, we don't want to lose the whole mission because we made an autonomy error. But of course, a lot of times when we've lost missions before, it's been due to some kind of human error. So we're certainly not any better than the autonomous systems in some cases. But yeah, there's still humans in the loop in terms of things like the route planning at sort of a short-term and a long-term scale. So what are we doing in the next few days and the next few weeks? But we can get a little bit more information from the rovers now to make a decision of, you know, should we drive this way versus this way, and see if the rover makes a better decision than we do. And then in that case, we might trust the rover in terms of where it thinks it should drive.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thanks for the question. Were you involved in development and engineering for the Mars rover as well as operations?
So I didn't work on like building the cameras per se. I'm not that kind of, I'm not an engineer in that capacity. I did work on calibration and testing of some of the cameras, as well as the code for how to operate the cameras themselves. So we actually operate all of the rover cameras. Well, Curiosity and Perseverance, we operate using Python. So if there are any students listening and you want to work on Mars rovers, Python is really, really helpful to know. For the older missions like Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, we actually did everything through shell scripts because they were based on software from previous missions that were launched in like, 1995. So it was pretty old school. We just didn't change anything. But I didn't actually build the cameras, but I tested them before we launched, and then got to do things like thermal vacuum testing, where you just babysit it in a chamber for a lot of hours. But that part's kind of cool because you're actually seeing the cameras in person before they get mounted to the rover and go to Mars.
How many satellites are there above Mars?
Well, what's the total count now? We've got, let's see, in order from like oldest to newest that are still operating, we have Odyssey, Mars Odyssey, Mars Express, Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, Maven, the ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter, the Mars Orbiter mission from India. We've got the Chinese Tianwen mission. We have Hope from the UAE. Am I missing any? I think that's all of them. So I think we have 8 that are still operating in orbit right now, which is amazing. That's the most we've ever had or operating at the same time around any other body, except for maybe the moon during the space race.
And I'm going to try to move pretty fast to make sure we get through all the questions. What do you think about commercial space projects? Are there risks that space exploration will head to where it's revenue instead of scientific progress? So, competing priorities.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The commercial space sector is always going to be motivated by dollars because they need some way to sustain their businesses. So I think that that's going to be inevitable in terms of seeing purely commercial stuff that isn't necessarily designed to have a scientific output. But at the same time, a lot of these places, if they want to get funding from NASA or another governmental space agency, it helps to have some kind of scientific bench to it, like as an addition to the commercial side, so that they can, sort of kill two birds with one stone. We'll do some science while we're doing other stuff. So I think what we'll see is like science and pure research will kind of stay in the realm of space agencies. They'll fund that kind of work. And then on the commercial side, we'll see things more like, prospecting for additional ice deposits on the moon or mineral exploration of asteroids and things like that. And then hopefully that also gets us some science along the way, because we learn what the asteroids are made out of. We learn where the ice is, and then we can figure out where the ice on the moon, like where it actually came from. How was it implanted in the places that we see it today?
Makes sense. Are there any continuation missions or replacement projects for Ingenuity in the works?
Not that I know of. I think the plan is just going to be to keep flying it until it either stops working or it just becomes, if it becomes any kind of operational burden, like if they need to just get going with Perseverance and they want to keep moving, they might end up leaving it behind at some point. But since it's been fully functional so far, they're just kind of bringing it along. Perseverance has done some longer drives. And I think initially the plan was not to have Ingenuity come along with it. It was going to do its tests at the field site where they left it initially, and then they would drive away. So now it's kind of tagging along with the rover, which is pretty cool.
Is there a possibility to put the geography scan instrument that the rover uses, to drive safely on Ingenuity 2 to fly into caves?
You probably could if you had like autonomous navigation combined with like computer vision and LiDAR systems to try and do it. But you'd still have to make sure that the rover was like positioned well to get the signal from Ingenuity. And so if your cave started to get to any like twists and turns, you wouldn't have that line of sight contact anymore. So you might be able to fly in a little bit, or at least until you hit a place where you're no longer in a straight line view of the rover, and then you'd have to stop.
And we have about 10 minutes. So I think we have enough time to get through the questions. Is there space for some kind of dirigible as an alternative to the copter for mapping the Mars surface?
Some folks have proposed ideas like that, like balloons or sort of that are like self-inflating, deflating. So they'll kind of rise and fall with the changes in the atmosphere over time. And then you could have something like a camera system attached to that. But there's none that are slated to fly anytime soon. It's more just mission concepts at this point.
Are there benefits with manufacturing things in space rather than on Earth? Interesting question. For example, can we construct bigger structures, manipulate liquids in new ways, or eject waste products into the sun?
There's certainly some things that we've seen that you can manufacture in space differently on Earth. There's certain types of like mineral crystal structures that you can grow to huge sizes in space that are good for certain applications. I'm blanking on the one that the folks at Made in Space have worked on, but they also think that they can make like longer fiber optic cables and some stuff with like bigger structures where you don't have to deal with gravity, and just the idea of on-orbit manufacturing in general, instead of making stuff on Earth and then paying, what is the price right now, like $10,000 or $20,000 per kilogram to launch it. You just have something like 3D printers, and you launch the raw materials up there, and then you construct it in space, so you don't have to worry about like rockets with larger and larger payload fairings and like these huge launch costs to launch like one gigantic structure or one gigantic spacecraft. You just build it all in orbit, and that would save us a lot of money in the long run.
Next question, something I love because I love aspiring entrepreneurs. what can startups do to make new space technology more accessible to all? And maybe I'll add on to that. Have you seen any, newer startups that are doing really interesting things?
I feel like there's so many in the space industry. It's hard to pick just one. We're seeing a ton of folks trying to deal with the space debris problem. So companies that are trying to figure out how we can either capture debris that's already up there and deorbit it, or create new standards for future spacecraft so that they have some system built in to deorbit them. Because that's definitely going to be a problem as more and more companies are able to launch stuff into space, as launch costs come down and the cost of manufacturing satellites comes way down. I mean, you can build a CubeSat for $1,000 at this point. The real cost barrier is the launch now. It's not building the satellites. I'm super biased in that I think what Planet is doing is really cool. We're imaging the entire world every day to look for change, because the idea is you can't fix what you can't see. And we're really focused on like understanding climate change, and then a lot of humanitarian use cases too, like monitoring human rights abuses, so that we can see, are there things that governments are or aren't doing in certain places. We can look at refugee camps to see how and where they're expanding to help with aid distribution. We can monitor natural disasters, so first responders can figure out where the worst affected areas are. And that's kind of changed a paradigm, because like Earth observing satellite companies previously have been really focused on sort of the defense and intelligence side, and Planet very intentionally tried to come from the other direction of, we called our satellites doves because we wanted them to be used for like peaceful scientific research kind of purposes. And so that's been really cool to see. But there's so many opportunities right now in terms of like working for cool, we call new space companies, or even to start your own company. Like, take a look at the landscape, see what's out there. What do you think is missing? And where do you think you could make a contribution? And then find the right people to get together to like form your own space company.
All right. We have a question coming in live from the event.
Oh, cool.
Hi, is it me?
There, yes.
Okay. Hello, Tanya. I'm Jens Birch. I'm a professor in physics, materials physics at Linköping University. I was thinking about your problem with the wheels that you had, those aluminium wheels.
Mm-hmm.
I have actually been involved in a space project where we developed coatings on titanium, very thin titanium spheres that they're like 10 centimeters in diameter and just a half a millimeter thick, like an eggshell, you can say. And those coatings are extremely hard and protects against wear. So the question I have is if you have applied any kind of additional coatings or protection onto your wheels to hinder the destruction.
I'm not actually sure. If there is, I haven't heard about them, but this sounds like a really cool idea in terms of trying to improve the durability of the wheels, because as we go to more and more harsh landing sites, because our landing technology is getting better, we'll certainly need to make sure that the wheels can stand up to whatever they encounter.
So it's actually the primary application of the coatings that we developed was not for the abrasion, but it turned out that these were for plasma probes to measure the plasma around Jupiter's moon.
Oh, cool.
Sorry, I'm sitting in the audience hall, but they're testing the sound. Yeah, so this was the main properties were for electrical properties and the emission properties and so on. But it turned out that the best coating that we could find for their purpose was also a coating which is used in the industry for protecting cutting tools when you cut metal. So it's extremely durable coating that can withstand super high temperatures, like they are the hardest at 900 degrees, in fact, Celsius. And I was thinking if this could be maybe something that could be developed for your application there with the wheels.
Yeah, it certainly sounds promising.
So maybe I could send you an email or something and explain about the properties of the coatings, and we could have just a short chat somehow.
Yeah, I'll put my email in the chat, and certainly if anybody else has questions like after the event too, feel free to shoot me an email there.
Well,
Yeah, no, I'll definitely. I was going to ask how people can get in touch with you, Twitter, social media, how to follow you a little more closely, because what you're doing is so fascinating. We have 2 more questions, so we're going to try to rush through them quickly here.
Yeah, I was just curious about if this is something that has been thought about before, and obviously not, which I'm surprised. But then I think we have a great solution for you, actually. So
yeah,
looking
sounds
forward
great.
to develop that.
Awesome. Thank you so
Thanks.
much for tuning in.
Okay, thank you. Let's keep in touch.
So 2 more questions quickly. I'll go to the Elon Musk question last. In future missions, how will we collect these samples, and what will that process look like? I don't recall exactly when this question came in. Not sure the context exactly, but maybe you recall.
I assume it's when we're talking about the Perseverance sample return. So those samples should come back in sort of the like 2028, 2030 timeframe. And the idea here is that the European Space Agency is going to build a fetch rover that will collect the samples that Perseverance leaves behind. It's going to leave them in a few different places to minimize the risk of not getting the samples successfully. So it'll kind of drop them along the way. We'll try to collect all of them, or at least as many of them as we can. And then it will take the fetch rover will take them to a little Mars ascent vehicle that will rendezvous with a spacecraft that's orbiting Mars. And then that will be what comes back to Earth. The architecture is still being designed, and it's a huge undertaking because we've never done sample return from Mars before, and we've never tried to launch anything off the surface of Mars. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of that. If you Google like Perseverance sample return, you could probably find the current drawings that the European Space Agency has released of the mission architecture for this. I don't have one on hand to show. I should add that to my presentation for the future now that they have some ideas of what they're going to do. But yeah, we should hopefully get the samples back around 2030.
And last question, Elon Musk said he wanted to place people on Mars by 2050. This is fascinating for sure. But do you think we'll have people living on Mars? It says within a decade's time, but within that time frame.
I wouldn't put anything past the ability of SpaceX at this point, because if we look at how much the space industry has changed in the last decade, I mean, 10 years ago, SpaceX wasn't really a major player in the game yet. There wasn't a commercial launch sector beyond sort of the big primes that NASA had been using for decades, like ULA and the launchers that the Europeans use, like Arianespace. But now we're seeing tons of small launchers all over the place. SpaceX is launching and landing rockets seemingly every week. Nobody ever thought that SpaceX would be the ones to get the contract to launch humans into space. And not only were they the first company to launch humans back into space from the United States after the space shuttle was retired, but now this week, I'm in Florida for the Inspiration 4 launch because SpaceX launched the first all-civilian crew into orbit. So they've just been working at this breakneck speed, and they've done so much in terms of innovation and just checking off all these boxes. And so I wouldn't put it past them that they would actually get a Starship to Mars before 2030. Do I think we'll have people permanently living on Mars by then? That feels like a little bit of a stretch, but I think it's not impossible that the first human mission to Mars could be from SpaceX, not from a space agency. And I think it could even happen within the next decade, even if it's just like a flags and footprints kind of mission.
I saved that one for last because, the big news this week, of course, and leading to yesterday was Inspiration 4. And so I'm curious your thoughts on that.
So I'm a little biased because my friend, Dr. Sion Proctor, is the pilot of the mission, which is why I'm down here to cheer her on. But I was really curious to see how this mission had impacted people outside of the space nerds that would be following this stuff anyway. And it's been really fascinating talking to people here in Cape Canaveral and Cocoa Beach in Florida who aren't space people. And a lot of folks have commented on how they were inspired by the fact that this was just a crew of regular people, some of whom who had never really thought they'd ever get the chance to go to space. And now they did. And it's been this beautiful thing to see. And I think it's opening doors to show that you don't have to have all of the right stuff to go into space. You might need a bunch of special qualifications to be, you know, a professional astronaut who's working on the International Space Station as your job for months and months at a time. But if you just want to go into space and see the Earth, you know, from orbit for a few days, basically, I think as long as your heart can stand up to the G-forces of launch and landing, you might be able to go. And of course, if you can either win a contest or afford the price tag until the price comes down. But yeah, I think that the mission has accomplished a lot of what it set out to do. Also, just seeing the reaction on social media from people who are not necessarily like strictly space people. So it's been really great to see.
It's truly incredible. I know people around me have been talking about it, and I would have never talked with space with them outside of things like this happening. So it's truly amazing. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. How can people follow you or get in touch with you?
So I put my email in the chat, but the best way to find me is like on Twitter as @Tanya of Mars. I'll put that in the chat as well. You can find me on most social media platforms as that, but I'm most active on Twitter. So if you find me on like Instagram or something and you send me a message, I probably won't see it for a while. But if you tweet at me, I'll probably see it very quickly.
Awesome. We will do that. Well, thank you again so much for your time. Everyone, we appreciate the questions. And, you know, I think we're about to get started on the main stage again pretty soon.
Nice. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Take care.
Bye.